Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate you all taking the time to come on board and join us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to come and see what Dr. Jenson has to say about the Tough Kid materials. We really appreciate that Bill is taking time to spend with us today. He's got a ton of information for you. So I'm not going to keep you long before we get him started, but I've got just a couple details to review. If you have questions about the content or if you have technical issues, you can send a message to us in the Q&A box on the right-hand side, bottom of your screen, and I will be monitoring those. My name is Jackie. I'm with Pacific Northwest Publishing, and we'll monitor that and try to help you out with any little technical snafus that you may come across. And then we'll also pay attention to questions for Bill at the end of the session. Bill has asked if you have a question, if you would note the slide number with your question, that would help him to be able to go back to that when during the Q&A portion. You can see the slide number if you look at the middle of the screen that has the Tough Kid on the screen today for you. Up just above that window, there is a number in the middle, and that is the slide number. And then as Bill changes slides, that slide number will change. It shows a 01 right now. So if you'll note that along with your questions, we will help him manage all those questions again at the end of the session. Technical questions, if you lose audio, which does periodically happen, we've had a few folks over time, we encourage you to reconnect or recall into the audio broadcast. Often that will take care of the hiccup the most quick way. Other than that, we are recording today's webinar, and we will email the link out to you towards the end of the week so that you can view it as a follow-up, review information, or share it with somebody else. All that said, I am going to turn things over to Bill right now for you.
All right. Thank you, Jackie. I'm going to turn my camera on just for a second here so people can kind of see me for a second. Then I'm going to turn it off. I came back from the desk and but it was strange because they give you nitrous oxide. It's like giving you a glass of wine, and I got in the chair and they had Netflix. I watched House of Cards. So if I look a little frumpled, it's because of that. And this is only my second webinar, so I appreciate your patience with me. It's the first one for Pacific Northwest. And looking at the attendee list, I see some people I know. I see Dr. Lane Vallam out there from Canyon School District. He got his PhD with me. You'd think Lane had enough of me in graduate school. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my video off, and I'm going to introduce you to the Tough Kid materials, the Tough Kids, and talk a little bit about what I'm doing with my students. So let me turn this off, and we'll get started here. Okay. Just got to make sure I got the slides working here. Great. Okay, well, we're going to be talking about Tough Kids. This is a Tough Kid, and basically I always get a kick out of parochial schools that say put them in a uniform and it'll handle their discipline problems. This is the uniform for a Tough Kid. It's almost universal. And this is his winter uniform, sunglasses, whole 9 yards. But this is what we'll be talking about today, and I'm going to like to introduce you to the Tough Kid series. Now, this is I'm sort of darned if you do, darned if you don't, because people say, well, you didn't tell us what kind of books were out there if you do, and if I talk about them, they'll say, well, this is just highlighting the Tough Kid series. But I'm very proud of this series, so I'm going to go through that a little bit with you and show you some of the new stuff that we're doing and some of the new stuff that we're developing. Number two, I'd like you to give you the definition of a Tough Kid. I think it's absolutely critical to understanding them because there's a lot of misinformation about Tough Kids out there. And then I'd like to look at the data on what their behaviors are, what's likely to happen with them, what's likely to change and not change for Tough Kids. Then what's really important for me is to talk about why we have Tough Kids. There's a lot of, again, misinformation about Tough Kids and what control they have over their behavior and what are the role of parents and families play and schools play. And I think it's really, really important to review what the research literature says about why we really do have tough kids. Then I'd like to talk about the issue that's on a lot of people's minds when I speak nationally, and that is, what motivates tough kids? What are the things that turn them on? Hopefully just to give you a couple of very practical suggestions, and then I'll probably end this webinar talking about Lenny and Squiggy, and it'll give you an idea, so the basic motivation aspects. Okay, here comes the Tough Kids series, and I'm going to go through each one of the books. This is the Tough Kid book. This is the second edition, and if you have the first edition, that's a very nice edition, but this has a lot of updates in it, but what's really important, I think, in this one is it has how do you get tough kids back from restricted services, whether it happens to be a self-contained classroom, a resource room, a specialized school, psychiatric hospital, and talks about how do you get them back. And you have to realize tough kids go back with just horrible reputations. And in our research, we found there's like a 3-week period when you send them back to general ed where they're under a microscope. And they have to be better than what I call the goody two-shoes kids. They've got to be better than those kids that are not identified as having problems. And so in here, we have also included, and this was on the urging of Marilyn Sprick, what we call the Teacher Pleaser Social Skills Training Program. Because when these kids go back, they essentially have to brown nose for 3 weeks. Otherwise, they're likely to be shuttled out very, very quickly. Number 2 is the Tough Kid Toolbox. Now this is different from the Tough Kid book in that the Tough Kid Toolbox is essentially a whole series of just interventions. They're freestanding interventions. The Tough Kid book is more of a system. It takes you all the way through a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, from definitions to how do you assess these kids, what are the interventions. The Toolbox is jam-packed full of things like home notes. Is full of like behavioral contracts, mystery motivators. So each one of them and the steps on how to do it with downloadable forms are in there that you can print. Number 3 is a social skills book, Tough Kid Social Skills book. This one was written by my colleague Susan Sheridan, and it's an excellent book, basically because social skills training does not work with externalizing disorders, nor does it work with ASD children on the autism spectrum. And what I mean by it doesn't work is you can train a kid, they'll learn the skill, they can tell you the skill, they can tell you the steps to the skill, but out in the general environment, they will not use the skill. It has less than 4% generalization, and basically how we train tough kids in social skills is pull them out, put them in a group, and then hope that they display that skill in the general ed environment, and they don't. This book has a major emphasis on what we call generalization of those skills back into the environment. So much so that it even has a complement social skills package for parent training. So you can do dually, you can do parent training and the social skills training with an emphasis on generalizations for tough kids. The next book is The Love of My Life, and you'll see why as we go along here. This is the Tough Kid Parent book. A lot of times people say, well, those tough kids, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You can't do much with them. Well, that's not what the research says. The research says working with externalizing disordered parents, the effect size on their children is 0.80. That is huge. That is better than stimulant medication. But we underrate what parents do. And this book is based on 30 years of doing parent training and putting hundreds and hundreds of parents through. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Now, the next book is the Tough Kid New Teacher book. We wrote this book for new teachers because new teachers are cheated at universities. Most of the times when general ed teachers go through the universities, they will take all sorts of courses like on the history of education, and they'll never take a practical behavior management course. And it's a major reason teachers leave teaching the first 2 years, is they cannot manage their basic kids in the classroom. So we wrote this book for new teachers. And we also introduce you to Mrs. Muttner in this book, because every school has a Mr. or Mrs. Muttner, and they've been there forever, and they are the most negative people in the world, and they're going to destroy the motivation of a lot of new teachers. And oftentimes they'll almost accost new teachers by saying, oh, you know, this school is difficult, the principal's an nincompoop, the children are just out of control, and the parents are non-committed. So this is for new teachers, because they're cheated, and I think in colleges and universities, and I teach at a university. But so is the next one. This is for tough kids. This is a Tough Kid Principal's Briefcase. This is like a Tough Kid book, but for principals, basically because principals are also cheated, I think, at universities. They'll go through their whole administrative training and rarely, if ever, take a class in basic discipline and behavior management. And lots of new principals, their first assignment, particularly if you're in middle school and you're the vice principal, is to be in charge of discipline. And what happens is it's generally overly punitive. This book has everything you want to know about how to manage a school, the Principal's 200 Club, how do you make in-school suspension a behavior management technique and not retributional punishment, because it's commonly abused. And the last one here in this little line is the Tough Kid Bully Blockers book. And this is a book I chose to use an example with you today. The Tough Kid Bully Blockers book is, I mean, everybody and their dog has a bully book out. But this one is different, and it's different from a couple of perspectives. Number one, you get the book, but the book is broken down into prevention types of skills that you put in a school. A lot of programs have prevention. The research is not very robust on those, but what they do not have is two other things that this book has, and that is how do you intervene with chronic bullies that keep coming up over and over and over again. A good part of this book is how do you manage chronic bullies. And it also has in it the starting point of a functional behavior assessment of bullying behavior, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. It also has what we call bully blocker shorts, and I really encourage you to go on Pacific Northwest's website and look at the bully blocker shorts, because our research has shown that if you try to teach students about bullying, generally the information goes in one ear and out the other. This is based on what we call fast hands animation. And there are no talking heads here. No one's going to be lecturing you about bullying, but it's all done with fast hands animation in teaching the basic standard definitions and interventions for bullying. And it's quite fascinating. And my graduate student, Ben Springer, did the art in this, and he's just a masterful, artist, and he's now a special ed director. So I encourage you to look at that. As I said, we are taken back by every bullying program we've reviewed. None of them have a functional behavior assessment of bullying, although functional behavior assessments required under federal law if a child has been suspended for 10 days or more. We've now developed and this will come out next year with Pacific Northwest, a functional behavior assessment of bullying system with an accompanying book that is full of interventions based on the functions of that bullying behavior. We were amazed that nobody has this out there yet. And the predecessor to this is we also have a functional behavior assessment of chronic absenteeism and truancy. Since this is a major issue, a major problem, and it has its complement book on interventions, both specific and universal procedures for managing chronic absenteeism bullying. Now, we've started to move in this direction also with the research at the University of Utah and working with my graduate students. We are interested in package-ready interventions. And what I mean by package-ready is if we cannot deliver it to you on your doorstep and you read the manual as a competent educator, you should be able to implement these evidence-based practice interventions without having a consultant looking over your shoulder. And one of the first endeavors that we've come out is what we call On Task in a Box. And this is a program that has everything included in a box, sort of like Amazon.com is going to deliver it to you with a smile on its face. They won't, Pacific Northwest will. And it uses all sorts of self-management techniques, motivators for self-monitoring, and the research on this, we've done now 3 studies, is just impeccable in improving the on-task rates of tough kids. And the jewel in the crown that's come out over the last 5 years is superhero social skills. And we developed this for higher functioning ASD students. And primarily what this is a social skills training procedure with everything that we know from the research literature that works: peer models, adult models, fast hands animations, self-management techniques, with the emphasis on getting students to generalize those skills once you train them to use them. We've done 7 master theses and dissertations now in total. I think this is the most research social skills training program for ASD students out there currently available. And we've also done 2 studies with externalizing disordered students, which is what a tough kid is, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. And as you see, everything is included here in a box. I want to be able to deliver this and have you be able to implement it without having me come and visit your site. Okay. All of the Tough Kid materials are evidence-based. You can see that on the toughkid.com website, which is just up today. And you can see it if you buy the Tough Kid book. In the back on the CD-ROM are all the research studies compiled over the years on all the basic Tough Kid interventions, because a lot of districts are now under the mandate of only using evidence-based practice procedures, as they should be with students with disabilities. This will give you the academic references for all the studies that's done on things like mystery motivators, reward spinners, bully blockers, the superhero social skills. So, tough kids, who are they? Get into the meat of this. This is fun to talk about. Tough kids, who are they? Well, as I said, there he is right there looking you in the face on Monday morning. I always like to joke about general ed teachers that had to take the history of education and learn all about John Dewey and had 16 weeks in a semester of John Dewey. They're not going to meet John Dewey on Monday. They're going to meet this tough kid. And it's best if you're trained to meet this student. They are the major reason teachers leave teaching the first 2 years. It's not all the money we pay you as educators, which we woefully underfund, but it is we haven't trained you, I think, properly to manage these kids in a proactive, positive way. If you're into positive behavior supports, if you look at the bottom down there, that's the 80% of students that just love learning. They came to school, they ask you for extra homework, they compliment you and thank you going to education. Above them are our 15% at-risk students. These are kids that are just about ready to go over the waterfall on discipline referrals. They have 2 to 3 discipline referrals, but are not quite there yet. On the top of the triangle is what we call our 3 to 7 percenters, because that's the percentage they're going to make up of your classroom, your student body, 3 to 7%. And they're the creme de la creme. It means if you're a general ed teacher, you're going to get 1 to 2 of these students every year in your classroom. And a good tough kid, a really good dedicated tough kid, can take up 30% of your time if you're a new teacher. Imagine that, 30% of your time. Well, these kids have all kinds of labels. They're labeled seriously emotionally disturbed, they're SED, they're labeled behavior disordered, they're labeled conduct disordered, they're labeled opposite defiant disordered, they're labeled attention deficit hyperactivity disabled. I like to say if you're SED, BD, ODD, CD, or ADHD, you are a tough kid, and these materials apply. Now, the basic 4 standard behaviors which define tough kids is everybody's mind's eye are the behavioral excesses. And these are the 4 behavioral excesses. Number 1, tough kids are known for non-compliance. They are a non-compliant. They will simply not follow your directions. Number 2, they are aggressive. They're verbally and physically aggressive. Number 3, they are argumentative. They will argue with you till the cows come home. And number 4, they destroy property. They'll tag it, paint it, shred it like a gerbil if you set them by it. Now, when we look at these 4 behaviors, the 2 most important for tough kids to get them in more trouble than anything is not aggression nor destroying property. It is non-compliance and being argumentative. But I like to say these behaviors are like the tip of an iceberg. You see this and you say, oh, look, you're on the Titanic. You know, your school's named the Titanic. That's a bad sign anyway if you're a brand new teacher and your school's named the Titanic. And you're sitting out front and you look out and you say, oh, look, there's you know, a tip of an iceberg. Noncompliance, aggression, argumentative, destroys property. That's not the biggest problem with tough kids. We know we can manage these behaviors, and we'll talk about what I mean by management. It is below the surface is what kills tough kids and educators, and they are often not recognized. It's the bottom part of that iceberg that's going to scuttle your Titanic school, and they are the behavioral deficits of these students. Now, these students are what we call contingency governed. They are not rule governed. What I mean by contingency governance is so important. What I mean by contingency governed is the next thing in that tough kid's environment which impulsively gains his attention will control his behavior. The next thing in that tough kid's environment which captures his attention is going to impulsively control his behavior. They are not rule governed. Now, 80% of those kids on the bottom of that triangle I showed you are what we call rule governed. That means they have a set of rules they've either learned from their family, their community, their school, their church, adult models, and they've internalized those rules. And when they're in situations, they use those rules to govern their behavior. They actually hold them up in their mind's eye and say, should I be doing this or should I not, when I compare it to this rule? That's not what a tough kid is. A tough kid, the next thing that captures his attention impulsively controls his behavior. And you cannot train, I do not believe there's research that shows that you can train a tough kid to be rule governed. You cannot train a tough kid to be rule governed. What you have to do is supply the rules for that student. And number two is the most important intervention, and I'm going to emphasize this again, most important intervention you can do for that tough kid is supervision. Because when tough kids are supervised, tough kids do not get into trouble. Number two, they're very poor at their social skills. They're 2 years behind their peers in social skills by the 6th grade. And this is research that came out of Oregon, 2 years behind. So it means if you put them in with non-disabled students, if you put them in with a group of goody two-shoes tough kids, not tough kids, it takes them about 45 minutes to reject tough kids. Why? Because tough kids are not as sophisticated in their social skills, nor they try to control those situations coercively. And number three, and this is just a killer, and that is 80% of tough kids are academically deficit. They have an academic deficit, and their major deficit is in the reading area. If you could do only a couple of things with tough kids, it would be increase your supervision and make sure that tough kid can read. Makes a huge difference, the research shows, in the longitudinal outcome of these kids when they enter adulthood. And on that note, if you look at RTI, Response to Intervention, again, it's on the bottom here, an appropriate reading curriculum is absolutely essential for tough kids. But I'm often disappointed in looking at reading curriculums that schools use and think are appropriate and evidence-based. They are not. They are not. I really would encourage you to look at the Visible Laboratories meta-analyses on reading programs and achievement. There are many programs out there, balanced literacy, reading recovery, which we do not think are very appropriate for tough kids. They may be fine for kids that already have fairly good reading skills, but for tough kids, they can be disastrous. Number two is specialized interventions. What we're doing at the University of Utah is looking at specialized interventions here at Tier 2. We worry that a lot of tough kids at this second level gets more of the same of what was at the first level. And if you have an inappropriate reading program and they're getting more of it, it's not going to help them very much. We look at all sorts of things to increase motivation, like dots for motivation. We look at mystery motivators, anything to keep a tough kid going academically. And on the top of the tier, we're looking now at things, we got 2 research studies going particularly, looking at accelerating learning curves for tough kids, where they pick up basic academic information, particularly things like your multiplication facts or the Frye sight word lists. Frye sight words make up 65% of the words that tough kids are going to read, and you cannot sound those words out. You have to basically get those Frye sight words down by memorization. But we're really looking at the response to intervention side of this for tough kids. Now, there are assumptions for tough kids, and if you violate the assumptions, we think you're going to hurt tough kids. And this is the underpinnings of all the tough kid standard materials we have out there. Now, the basic first assumption in dealing with tough kids is, number 1 assumptions, tough kids are managed, they're not cured. Anybody that says they're going to cure a tough kid has not read the research literature. There's probably only one person out there, and she's at the University of Washington, Kara Webster Stratford, that shows that you can take an externalizing disordered tough kid and intervene intensively enough and early enough that you can change the trajectory of these kids. Tough kids basically are managed, not cured, which means if something works in one school year, you're incumbent upon passing it to the next school year. Again, emphasize, tough kids are managed, they're not cured. Number 2, there are multiple causes for tough kids, and we'll talk about that. It's not one thing. You know, the trouble with this, I always like to ask educators, I always like to say, you know, who do you blame for tough kids? And educators always say, well, the parents. I always like to say to parents when I'm talking to them, who do you blame for tough kids? Well, they blame us often. You have to realize what a tough kid is doing at home, he's probably also doing at school. And what he's doing at school, he's doing it at home. We truly believe tough kids' parents are your allies. And that's why we've developed so many materials around working with parents. You can't make them feel ashamed. You cannot make them feel guilty. You cannot make the interactions negative with them. What you have to do is give them practical information. And one of my favorite cartoons showing what a tough kid does at home, he does at school, and what he does at school, he does at home is this. This is parent-teacher conference night. And here you have these 2 shredded people, and one of them says, you must be Timmy's dad, I'm Timmy's teacher. This is basically the rule. We believe parents are your allies. Number 3. Positives work better with tough kids. That's why the tough kid materials are very proactive and very positively oriented. It's not that, you know, I'm a loosey-goosey, positive guy. I am not. What the research shows, again, out of the University of Oregon, this is Gerald Patterson's research, is tough kids are 3 times immune to punishment. It means that punishment has been used so much with these kids, they're basically immune to it. It's like water off of a duck's back. They can take, 3 times what goody two-shoes can take and tell you to bring on more. What works best with tough kids is positives. Why is that the case? Because tough kids oftentimes don't get a lot of positives, And I have the assumption number 4, and this is basically a humorous assumption, and this is called the mystery assumption. And I always like to say, take this down, take notes down. This is the 4th assumption, it'll change your life. And basically this assumption is, never, ever, ever, ever go on a field trip with a tough kid. Now, of course, that's a joke. And I always like to say this to audiences because it invariably gets a laugh. And I did this in Chicago a number of years ago, and a teacher about fell out of her chair laughing. And I said, lady, it's a joke. And she says, it is and it isn't. And I said, okay, you got a story to tell me. Tell me your story. And she says, well, Dr. Jenson, I'm a self-contained teacher of ED kids in the Chicago area, and our kids were doing so well, okay, that's the common antecedent, doing so well that we decided we were going to go on a field trip, and we practiced field trip behavior at school, what you did in an emergency, what happened when you got lost, how not to touch anything, and we decided to go to the Field Institute in Chicago. And she said, the minute we stepped in that door of that museum, Dr. Jenson, she said, all that training went out the window. They were touching things, they were running around, and she said, we came up to this one exhibit, and it had a curtain and a banner across the top. And the banner said, behind this curtain is the world's most interesting primates. And so the whole class pulled it back, and of course what it was a mirror. And they all looked at it and said, oh, you know, we're the world's most interesting primates. She said, Dr. Jenson, it wasn't 5 minutes later, we were looking at another exhibit, and I heard a blood-curdling scream and a thud. And she said, I immediately looked for Rocky and Bubba, because 90% of the screams and thuds are caused by Rockies and Bubbas out there. And she said, Rocky was gone, and he had stealthily gone back. He loved this exhibit, got up behind the curtain, and was waiting for the next customer. And it happened to be the world's worst customer, she said. It was this like 99-year-old lady in a walker with a cane hanging over it, and who came up and read the banner, the world's most interesting primates, behind this curtain. And there Rocky was behind the curtain waiting to spring. She opened up the curtain, and Rocky jumped out and said, boo! And she picked up her cane and hit him over the head. That was the womp. And the teacher said, don't you just love some of their behaviors? I mean, they're stupid, but you got to laugh at it. And that's the fourth assumption in working with tough kids. You got to love them for what they do. I mean, it's going to be inappropriate, but some of it's downright funny. And I knew this teacher was a really good teacher, you know, when she says you got to like tough kids and their behaviors. Okay, what I'd like to also show you next, since I'm a professor, and professors like to be scientific-y and show you data. I'd like to show you some data here now on behaviors that's going to go away and not go away for tough kids. And these are very important data, and the reference is on the bottom down there. And if you notice, these data go from age 4 to 18. That's all childhood generally. And each dot here is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids. Circles are males, squares are females, because some problems become sexually differentiated as you get older, and we'll see. The open circles, open squares, these are the goody two-shoes kids. The kids, quote unquote, I shouldn't use the term normal, but these are the kids that's never been referred for a problem. The closed square, closed circles, these are your tough kids. Now, it's important when these data were collected is that these closed squares and closed circles was before any intervention had been done for the referred tough kid, that is special ed or mental health interventions. And if you look at the very top of this graph, you can see what the referral problem was. I always laugh at this one because if you look at this graph, it's pretty low in frequency. It's pretty stable from age 4 to 18. And the referral problem's too neat and clean. I like to say, we don't get many referrals for kids who are too neat and clean. These are data to show that all basic children are essentially little pigs and like to live in slime and filth and toxic buildup. And that goes from age 4 all the way to age 18. So let's move on here, and I'll show you some others. See, a lot of times people are going to say, oh, you know, Dr. Jenson, these behaviors will go away naturally. We just leave them alone. These are some of the only behaviors that's going to go away naturally for you, and there are not very many of these. Now, if you look at the first panel up there, now remember, these are hundreds and hundreds of kids. Whining behavior. If you're 4, 5, 6, and 7, whining behavior is a major social skill for you that drops pretty dramatically until you get 18 and go back to college, and it goes back up. The next panel there is demands attention. I love this one. This is perfect. It just shows you that, look at the difference between, you know, the goody two-shoes non-disabled kids and tough kids. There's a huge difference in demanding attention there. That's why we say 30% of the time of a new teacher can go out the window with a couple of good tough kids. But they both get better over time, but they never ever graphs never commingle. Fears. I don't worry about fears. That's the next panel for kids. Fears go away naturally. When parents say to me, oh, Dr. Jenson, my son's having nightmares, he's having nightmares of Raiders of the Galaxy. What should we do? We say, well, don't let him go see Raiders of the Galaxy. Now, the next one I get a big kick out of because you can see I get excited about these graphs still. And I've talked about them for a million years. This is Can't Sit Still. Now, if you look at this graph, look at the very top graph there. That's male tough kids. Look at the difference. Male tough, just because males, in my view, are weaker protoplasms. We have a lot more problems than females. And here you can just see it. We wiggle a lot more, and we wiggle throughout childhood a lot more. They all get better, but we males are still wiggling a lot. Next one is wets the bed. I don't worry too much about wets the bed. It gets better over time, and it will get better in about 90% of the cases. If it doesn't, after about age 7 to 8, there is a place called the Bedwetting Store on the internet. I have no affiliation with the Bedwetting Store, but they have very evidence-based interventions there. Incredibly effective. The next one is BM outside of toilet. That's not behavior management outside of toilet. The term for this is encopresis. This is pooping your pants, which really is going to get you socially ostracized. But it will generally go away also. But if it doesn't, after about age 6 to 7, it's really stigmatizing, and there's a wonderful website. It's put out by the University of West Virginia Department of Pediatrics, and it has a website that you can sign up, has evidence-based practice to stop encopresis in children called You Too Can Poop. It is a wonderful website. Moving on here, these are behaviors that's going to get worse. They're not going to go away. The first one is swearing behavior. I love this graph. This is my favorite graph out of all of these graphs. If you notice, this is where females really lag behind. If you notice, little male tough kids have a foul mouth from the get-go, from age 4. And now if you look at tough kid females, it takes you to about age 14 to catch up with a little male tough kid. It's the only thing you're ever behind him, by the way, in comparison to us, in my view. The next one's arguing behavior. Look at that. We guarantee you, if you were arguing at age 5, you're going to be arguing at age 18. And you really have to intervene early if you're going to make a big difference there. The next one here we have is acts without thinking. Now, if you look at the top graph there, these are male tough kids. We look like lemmings jumping off the cliffs here, okay? This is the tough kid that you take on a field trip to go swim, and they jump in the 10-foot water, and they're going down for the 3rd time, and you walk over and you say, can you swim? And they'll say, never really thought about it, but it seems like a good skill now. This is what I mean by tough kids being contingency governed. They act before they think. Panels on the bottom there, disobeys at home, disobeys at school. That is the signature problematic behavior of tough kids. It is the most commonly complained about behavior by both teachers and parents. The next panel there, lack skill. You can talk to them until you're blue in the face, and you're not going to change their behavior much by talk, the research shows. Next ones you look at, fighting behavior, extremely stable. Hot temper, extremely stable. Attacks people, extremely stable. Then if you look at the ones on the bottom, this really shows you that tough kids really need social skills training, but not the train and hope approach that we use of pull-out groups, but a generalization approach. You can see the first one is not liked. The next one doesn't get along, and then look at the next one, is teased a lot. They are unmercifully teased. Now, the last set of slides here, look at the first one, poor schoolwork. Look at this from an RTI model perspective. These kids are being crippled in the 1st grade, not later, the 1st grade. The faster we intervene, the better. That's why the RTI model, I think, is such a sound model rather than using a discrepancy model to get to these students early. This is a function of 3 things that we think. Number 1 is you didn't get the basics of reading. You didn't get an early start at home. Number 2 is you have horrible study skills. You're not organized, and it's starting from the get-go. And the third is you're not on task. you're not on task. If you look at the next slide over, can't concentrate, it is a very telling slide. The average tough kid is on task 50% of the time. The average goody two-shoes student, 85% of the time. Do the math. Subtract 50% on task of a tough kid from 85% of a general ed student. That's a 35% difference. That means you can have the best curriculum in the world. If they're not on task, they are missing 35% of the information stream. You can see why we were so interested in putting interventions for on task in a box. If you can get a student on task, you get a double benefit. Number one, they're going to learn more because they're on task more. But here's your second benefit. It's a stealth benefit. And that is, if you're on task, it is impossible to misbehave. So by getting them on task, you get the double benefit of learning more, and you displace a lot of inappropriate behaviors. Next slide, lying and cheating. These kids will tell you all kinds of stories. The last three slides on the bottom here, I want to go through quickly because I got to really move fast here. You realize that after age 10, tough kids will find other tough kids to hang out with almost anywhere. And if you get the Tough Kid book, you'll see why we put so much emphasis now on positive group contingencies. After age 10, you're not into individual interventions most of the time with tough kids, you're in the group interventions. Look at truancy. This is why we did the functional behavior assessment of truancy. After age 10, it is dramatically influenced by peers. And, you know, truancy schools are fine, but they're ineffectual. Fining parents and having them go to court in contempt because their child's not going to school is ineffectual. You need to do an assessment of why this is happening. Same for drugs and alcohol. It is dramatically influenced. Now, I'm going to really move quickly because I've got to move here fast. We're running out of time. Tough kids, why do we have them? It's multiple causes. These are all the basic standard causes why we have tough kids. Sure, parent background, parenting style, divorce, supervision, association with inappropriate peers, poor school experiences. It's not one of these things, it's many of these things. And it's genetics, and I always love going through this. This will give you insight into why you have tough kids. This is a meta-analysis on adoption studies about why we have tough kids. Please count down 5 lines if you can, and you're going to find out 50% of the variance in the measures of antisocial behavior in tough kids is attributable to genetic effects. This is based on 3,795 twin pairs, and 338 of them were adopted out. It's a chicken and egg problem. You must realize that. You're going to have 4-to-1 males to females, and clearly the sex of the child is a genetic problem. Now, I like to ask, I'll go back here. I like to ask participants, if you've got more than one child, how many of you have children who exactly the same behavior and temperamentally? Exactly the same behaviorally and temperamentally? Very few of you. When I've asked this question, I bet it's 1 in 1,000 raise their hands. Point being, they're all coming from the same home, they're all coming from the same parents. If parents had all the control over all the variables of these kids, we have lots of kids who are very similar. It's not the case. Diversity is the rule in children found in families. Not similarity, but diversity. And I like to say having a tough kid is a crapshoot. And when you throw the dice, these are the variables of what you're going to get. These are temperament variables, and they're looked at in very young children. If you want the references, it's Chess and Thomas, Origins of Behavior Disorders, and these are infants. And they looked at infants here, looking at the temperament characteristics in these infants. These are all genetically loaded. Activity level, how rhythmic they are. Do they approach things? Do they adapt? How intensive are they? What is their threshold of responsiveness? Do they have a chip on their shoulder when you merely say something and knocks it off and the kid goes into a temper tantrum? Quality of mood, most important characteristic for a new mother to have in her child, and distractibility and attention span. Now remember, when they did this research, this is genetic and it's done on infants. This is what they found. It's going to tell you why you're going to have tough kids. every year. There's a reason for tough kids, a natural, biological reason. And what we think here is that when they did this study, what they found is 40% of infants fell into an easy temperament category. They were friendly, adapted well. They made you feel like the best parents in the world. 15% were slow to warm up. They were intense. It took them a while to adapt. Excuse me, they were mild. They were not intense. The last group is what's called difficult temperament infants, and this is in a lot of the genetic history of a lot of tough kids. They're unpleasant, they cry a lot, they're irregular, and they react poorly to change. Now you must remember, these are genetically loaded. And I love this because here you have two fathers looking in the maternity ward, and one unfortunately has got a difficult temperament infant, and he says he's only 2 days old and he's already been in timeout 9 times. But this is true. Parents laugh at this because they know it's true, parents of tough kids. And 35%, they couldn't type in infancy. 18% of tough kids grew up to have behavior problems in school. 70% grew up. There's your reference right there, to have problems in school. That's a huge difference from infancy to predict this. And for the longest time, I wondered, why does this happen? Why do we have this? Why would biology do this to us? And then I read this study, and I knew why. These are Masai Warriors, and these are out of Kenya. And a guy named DeVries did a study and published it, and he went to look at temperament in Masai Warriors rather than New York City. And what he found is that Masai's herd cattle, and they put it behind that thorn corral there. And when he went to do the temperament study on Masai's, he found that the breakdown was the same as New York City. 40% easy, 15% slow to warm up, 10% difficult, and 35% they couldn't type. He came back 5 lousy months later, and what he found was this. It was a disaster for the Masai's. 97% of their cattle had died from drought. Only 2 out of the 10 easy temperament infants he'd identified, which we value so much in our society, were alive and well. All the rest had died from malnutrition. Every difficult temperament infant he'd identified were alive, relatively healthy, and kicking. We think there's a genetic loading for this. When the going gets tough, tough kids get going. They're going to get that milk from that cow. They're going to live where others probably don't. But in industrialized societies, we punish this. And this is the reference if you want to look this up. It gives you a nice perspective on why you're going to get tough kids. It's about 50-50. 50% is probably biology, 50% learn. This is the learn part. I really want to go through this quickly. This is a coercive interaction. This is what happens with tough kids. This is when you're trying to get a tough kid to do something. Now, this may not be your tough kids, but it sure is tough kids I deal with. Number one, let's say you're going to go in and try to get a tough kid to do something. You come in and you say, wouldn't you like to? The tough kid ignores you at the same time. So you try to cajole them into it and say, come on, please. Now this delays you. If your own child is saying to you at home, just a minute, you're at step 2. Number 3, now you get upset. You yell at the child. So now the kid gives you excuses. And there's that arguing behavior and starts to argue. Now you want to level a consequence. And you shouldn't level a consequence at this point in time because you're very angry. Now the kid starts a temper tantrum and is aggressive. And 60% of the time at this point, the adult withdraws the request. And once you do that, every one of these things are rewarded over here, learned and rewarded. Now, this is not the only mechanism. We think biology has something to do with this, but this is the learned mechanism, and at least makes 50%. And what happens to this is once you withdraw your request and all those things are learned, tough kids learn to be aggressive, it impedes their social skills and their academic performance. Now, how to stop this, I'm going to give you this really quickly, and that is, don't use a question format. We like to use antecedent control, and the antecedent in getting a tough kid to do something is you asking that child to do something. First of all, don't use a question format. Number 2 is get close to the child. The average distance is 20 feet from a teacher when they give a command. Get up 3 feet. Make eye contact, but be sensitive to cultural issues used here. Only use 2 requests. If you go beyond that, the nagging or nattering effects. Don't yell at a child. You're going to get less compliance when you yell at a child. You have to give them enough time, 3 to 5 seconds. It's always better to be non-emotional than emotional. Describe the behavior you want, and remember, reinforce a child. 85% of the time, when a tough kid does exactly what we want, we ignore them. Now, precision request is built right into the tough kid materials. And again, this is to stop coercion. And a precision request is, how do you give a request? So you say, please, you wait 3 to 5 seconds. If the child complies, you reinforce them. If they don't, we do this, Rex Forehand has done this, Carol Epstein-Stratton has a variation, many researchers do this. We use a second command, and we use a signal word here, and the signal word is need. And so now you come through and say, now I need you to, and you wait 3 to 5 more seconds. If they comply, you reinforce them. If they don't, then you have to follow through with the consequence. And the consequences have to be consistent over time. And I would really, we also use other signal words. Instead of I need you to, you can use the word instruction. You can also use a student's name and the direction. But let me refer you to this. If you really want a good reference on precision requests with videotapes, go to the Utah State Office of Education on the web and go to the Least Restricted Behavioral Intervention website. They have all this material laid out, as does Pacific Northwest publishers, and they have videotapes that go with it. Okay, I want to go quickly through what motivates tough kids, and then I want to open it up to questions. Because I get a lot of questions about tough kids not being interested in learning, tough kids not being motivated. I like to say, how many tough kids do you know that are in kindergarten that come to school that are not motivated? Very few. They're all ready to show up, drink the chocolate milk, not take a nap, and rock and roll. And how many tough kids do you see that come to high school that are not motivated? They're legion. Something happened between kindergarten and the 12th grade. What we think happened. Non-motivation, people use terms like, rewards or reinforcers, incentives for them. They often view tough kids as lack of incentive or drive. But you got to realize when you use rewards, you have to be careful about won't do, which means they will not, they can do it, but they're not going to practice it, or cannot do. That means it's not in their repertoire. And if you use rewards with kids that can't do it and they're frustrated because they cannot earn the reward, you're going to hurt their motivation. You have to realize that it's like heavy metal poisoning. And I like to say non-motivation in tough kids is like heavy metal poisoning. Think back when something negative has been said to you, and there's really good research on this. If something is said negative to you, you're going to remember it. If something is said positive to you, you're going to forget it over time. You're far more likely to remember negative aspects that's been said to you. And tough kids are punished a lot. And it's sort of like heavy metals that build up in your system and don't go away over time. And it kills motivation. So we like to say, if you're going to use incentives with tough kids, how do you incentivize them? How do you find out? Ask them. Keep track of what they ask you for. Watch what tough kids like to do. Think like a tough kid and let them sample things. There's got to be limits. Got to have the golden rule. Can't cost too much, can't take too much time, can't cost too much money. We like to say use the incentive formula for tough kids, and that is reinforce them immediately. Do it frequently. Make it with eye contact, being sensitive to cultural issues. Do it with enthusiasm. Describe the behavior. Make it behavior-specific praise. Build up anticipation in them. You can sell anything. We've sold zucchinis to tough kids for behavior. Look at variety and variability. The trouble with most educators is we don't do it immediately, and we do not use variability. We do it on a fixed schedule at the end of the day, at the end of the month, at the end of the year. We love mystery motivators. Just to go through this quickly, mystery motivators, tough kids will work for them. You write a secret incentive down, seal it in an envelope, put it in a question mark, put it in the front of the classroom. You'll drive them crazy trying to earn what's in a mystery motivator. We like to use these with individual tough kids, and this is in the Tough Kid Toolbox. If you notice, there's an envelope. It's on a piece of paper. It's got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and these color switchers here at the ends is invisible ink, and in those little days, we will put an M or an X, which means if the kid does the behavior, we let them have the marker, they color it in. If it magically appears, they get what's in the envelope. And you can see how this happens. We've done so much research in getting kids, tough kids, not to go into timeout, tough kids to turn in their homework, tough kids to keep on reading using mystery motivators. And this is just the rules of thumb. And these are some of the mystery motivators that we use out of the Tough Kid Toolbox. And we tape the envelopes on the back because they love the pictures so much, and these are just some of the reasons that we've used them for. We also use reward spinners, and we learned this from a grocery store. And that is the grocery store, I went in for years and never win anything, and I'm scratching those little things off because you can't use lotteries in Utah, so there's no gambling, so you have to go to the grocery store to do it. And I never win anything. And then one day I won. I couldn't believe it. And the checker lady even called the bag boy over and said, we have a winner here. And they were matching up my codes, and I thought, wow, it's a trip to Hawaii. And the lady looked at me and says, you know, no, you have won a generic yogurt. So it's the only thing I ever won. So what we like to do is use this we use it in a lot of our programs, all the way from teenagers all the way down to preschool kids. It's like a Candyland spinner with an arrow on it, and each one of those numbers corresponds to a menu where we write in water-based pen what an incentive is, and then we have the envelope. So if the child does what you want, we allow them to spin it. Whatever it lands on, variably, they get. We've used this with whole classes for rule-following behavior. We use this with ASD students in our superhero social skills training program. And whatever it lands on, you get. See, number 4 is a lot bigger. So that's generic yogurt. And number 1 is Hawaii, and because it's a lot smaller slice of the pie. And I just put this in the very last. People say, well, can you really use this? I'm proud of these data. This has nothing to do with children. These were 2 disabled men in an institution who smoked. And they were referred to us because they were developing throat cancer. And they were named Lenny and Squiggy, not Jim and Bill. And I love Lenny and I love Squiggy. I loved Lenny because he could swear. He was ASD. His swearing was like art. And Squiggy was a mute, and they hung together. And the physicians in this institution wanted us to stop smoking. Smoking is more addictive than cocaine. So when people doubt how mystery motivators or spinners work, I always think of these data. We publish this in the Journal of Experimental Psychiatry and Behavior Therapy. And on the bottom is aggression, and on the top is their cigarettes. And this is actually, Lenny is Jim, and Squiggy is Bill. And we had to get them to stop smoking their cigarettes. And so I said to Lenny, I said, Lenny, I got a new thing for you here. I said, I got a new game for you. And he says, what do I have to do, Dr. Jenson? I said, you got to give me all your cigarettes, and you got to play the game. He said, I won't do that. I won't give you my cigarettes. But I'd watched Lenny, and I'd watched Squiggy in their cottage, just like I suggested when you're assessing incentives. And I knew what reinforced them. And I said to Lenny, hey, Lenny, you could get a trip to McDonald's. You could get the gardening tools to work outside. I knew those were not high-valued reinforcers. I knew the high-valued reinforcer was Lenny, was who was going to be king of the TV set for an hour, because they would all fight about this on their cottage. And I wanted him to play the game. Now, of course, if you look at a spinner, Hawaii is going to be a cigarette. And all the other rewards, including getting to be king of the TV sets, were larger wedges. And he says, no, Dr. Jenson, I won't play this game. And I still laugh when I think of this. And I said, you know, Lenny, I'll make you a deal. You could be king of the TV set, which means that at 4 p.m. you could watch Judge Judy. And I knew that's what he loved. It galvanized him. He says, you mean I could watch Judge Judy and the nurses couldn't change the TV channel? I said, absolutely. If you look at these data are over 3 years. And look at the cigarette. For Lenny, we cut his cigarette smoking in half. For Squiggy, we cut it by 3/4. So these are very powerful techniques. I just wanted to show you this because I look back at this little study fondly. We've used this with ASD students. We've used it with tough kids. We've used with tough kid adolescents called Wheel of Fortune and Mystery Motivators. So this at least gives you kind of an overview of the program. And I'll stop there and open it up for some questions.
Fantastic, Bill. Thanks so much for sharing all of that information. At the moment, I don't have any content questions, but we certainly would encourage you, if you have content questions, to go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box for us now, and we'll run them by Bill.
I hope I haven't blown you all guys away and you want to leave.
I do have just a little bit of feedback, Bill, from Lane Vallum, who you acknowledged at the beginning, and he just wanted to thank you and said he was working with a group of early career special educators in their district, teaching a class akin to interventions in the schools, and he plans to share this talk with them as soon as it becomes available on the website. We will put the recorded version of the webinar on our website and send a link out to everybody in the next couple days, and you'll be able to access this information and review it and share it with other folks, others of your colleagues. And I'm just skimming, looking like we have a couple questions coming in. I have a question. Let's talk about using these interventions in general education classrooms.
Oh, absolutely. The tough kid materials are geared, of course, for the child at the top of the triangle. But so many of these interventions can be used in general education. This is why I really like to emphasize the new teacher book, Tough Kid book, because it talks about how do you set up rules in a classroom, how do you arrange your classroom, how do you use basic positive group control methods, because general ed classrooms are also groups that oftentimes can be difficult. And if you're an educator, you know it waxes and wanes over the years. Mystery motivators. So we've used these techniques many, many, many times, and I think the books are replete. And they're really good for general ed situations also, for that kid that falls between the cracks, I think, and is failing but does not quite qualify for special ed. I think tough kid materials and tough kid interventions are particularly useful for them.
Okay. I have another couple questions. I have one inquiring about what do you do when there are several tough kids in the same classroom?
Well, that is the classic question. What you do is you're in a group intervention mode, and I wish I had longer to talk about this, but we've used all sorts of interventions in classrooms. You split them into teams and you use something called the good behavior game. We've also used a free app called Classroom Dojo with group contingencies. Go to the website Classroom Dojo if you haven't seen that, and it is amazing what you can do for general ed. There is a wonderful app called Decibel 10, which it costs 99 cents and records the sound level in a classroom where there's general ed or special ed. We hook that up to a projector, and we make a group contingency out of it on the classroom, keeping their noise level below a certain level. Now, you may say, well, that keeps them quiet, so what? Well, what it keeps them quiet, so what is there's a direct correlation between how loud a class is and how many inappropriate behaviors are occurring. So if you've got a couple of tough kids, you're in the group mode, and group contingency should have your name on it. Good question.
All right, we've got a couple others, and we could kind of see how people are if they're patient, or we could also follow up on some of these via email. I have another question about a student who passively refuses to do work, sits there and won't write, is quiet but has said no to teachers, or will argue about what he needs to do.
Well, I think what you've got is a student with heavy metal poisoning, do you not? He's failed so many times that he's not willing to do anything. So what we generally try to do with a student like that is to make, it's sort of like shaping very small steps. And what you have to do is find something that student likes and something they want, try a mystery motivator, and then try the very smallest amount of work. Now, one of the strategies that we really do like to use is called dots for motivation, where students actually earn those little dots that you put on files, to mark them. But for, let's say it's a math problem, and he won't even try that. It's a very simple math problem. And let's say you can step him through and help him work one math problem, and he earns 1 dot. What we've done is the next day he can put those dots on any problem on his assignment that he doesn't want to do, and he gets full credit for that. And we have been phenomenally successful with that. We've done a dissertation and a master's thesis. So there's a lot of things you do, but you got to realize you've got a customer there that's probably had a lot of failure and doesn't even want to try. And you really can't blame them. You really have to reinforce very small steps. And actually, we very much like working with students like that.
All right. I have another question. We still have a fair number of people hanging in there with us, so if you want to keep going, Bill, we can keep going.
Sure.
I have a question about the non-tough kids getting jealous about tough kids getting not getting rewards when the tough kid does.
That's what we call the equity argument. And actually, I just don't buy that argument, okay? It generally doesn't happen, particularly if you set up the classroom system so everybody gets rewarded. That includes, non-tough kids and tough kids. But people that oftentimes say this indicate it's what we call the equity argument. If I do one of these things, I've got to do it for everybody to be fair. That's not true. That is absolutely not true. I like to say, how many of you have ramps in your school? And a lot of times people say, well, of course we have ramps. I say, what do you have ramps? They'll say, well, so kids in wheelchairs can get in. I say, well, do you give every kid a wheelchair? No. Every kid doesn't get a tough kid program. What you really need to do, I think, is realize, particularly when these kids get older, they need extra special intervention sometimes. And you can design these so that peers also get these. This is why we're so much into the group management, so everybody can get them. I'll give you one example of jealousy. This is the perfect kind of jealousy you want with tough kid materials. As I said, we're trying to accelerate the learning curve and get these kids to learn more sight words or their math facts. And they fall behind. They have to do very boring types of paper and pencil types of assignments, worksheets. What we've done, and this is Mary Beth Pemmel's dissertation, is we put all of our math facts on iPods, and we present them on what we call a time delay. And we can accelerate the learning curve of 3 out of 4 tough kids where they pick up information very quickly. And I loved it when the non-tough kids walked up finally once and said, we would like to also use the iPods to learn our multiplication facts and sight words. I thought, perfect, everybody can use iPods. Don't use an excuse that other kids are going to get jealous because tough kids are getting services they need to be successful.
We had a question also following up on that about that in terms of the parents of non-tough kids getting upset when they find out that tough kids are getting rewarded for behaviors. Any just thoughts on addressing that?
Yep, been in the business for 35 years. Never had one get upset yet, particularly when they saw the basic material. I'd had them say, I'd like my kids to be able to do something like that, but I've never had a problem with it in 35 years. So.
We've got a couple questions that kind of relate to middle high school, and I'm going to jump a little bit ahead and then come back to those because I think those kind of group together. And then I have another question that might be a better just sort of one-on-one answer. I have a question about how do you use the mystery motivator or spinners so they don't lose their effectiveness? How often would you recommend using them?
Okay. Well, lots of people want to fade them out, and that's fine. But how many times in your life are the incentives faded out? How many times does business fade these things out? The trick is variety. making sure that you change your reinforcers with them and using anticipation. And we're really good at using anticipation to get tough kids to keep on going. As I said, we sold zucchinis to tough kids. It's all what you do. And if you really think about it, and there's a wonderful, if you're into TED Talks, I love TED Talks. There is a wonderful TED Talk on you enjoy more of what you anticipate than actually what you get. There's a research at the University of Washington. So it all revolves around variety and anticipation. And, you know, I don't think you fade everything out in life. We all look forward to things, and you can keep kids going, following rules, the academic aspects, for a very long time.
Okay, terrific. I think that's most of the time. I jump to just a question, and I apologize because I'm scrolling back and forth since there's a few comments have come in. Somebody's looking for good motivators for middle school and high school tough kids.
Oh boy, some of these kids, now I'll get in trouble here. You know, because you got to think like a tough kid. When we were dealing with some high school tough kids, now, you know, I mean, this is Utah, and we have to balance this, and you got to realize I will do almost anything to get, you know, a tough kid to acquire academics, particularly reading. One of the big incentives for us for high school kids was a cup of coffee at the desk in a self-contained room. They would do almost anything for a cup of coffee, you know, at desk. We've had them, because we know this is going to happen to tough kids in high school, you got one free pass on in-school suspension. You know, that drove the administrators wild. Kids loved it. Okay, they would work to be good to avoid, you know, going into in-school suspension. I think of all the things that we've done, particularly with our Principals 200 Club. Let me encourage the participants to look at the Principals 200 Club. Google, particularly with the middle school applications for that, where we have May I Serve You, where you got to go in the front of the line and the teacher actually got your lunch for you. So there's a whole bunch of things, and there's a number of studies of behavior checklists on, you know, what high school and middle school kids want. The trouble is, they want what we want. They want fast food, sleeping in 1 hour past the alarm, listening to their music. There's a lot of different things you can do there. And there's one I'm trying to think of, one that, oh, it's the air gun. There's an air gun that you can buy with middle school kids. I forget the name right now. It'll come to me in a moment. They cost $12.95. Middle school kids love to be shot with the air gun. Okay, it's a simple thing.
I do have someone who suggested just a couple middle school incentives. Feel free to a free pass to the front of the cafeteria line, or a homework pass.
Yep.
Another. One of our Airzuka, yep.
Airzukas. Don't let them shoot each other. You shoot them with air. They have to earn the privilege of being shot by you with air. Airzukas, wonderful.
Okay, I think that we have covered most of the broad scale questions. We'll take just a minute to see if anybody pops something in there, if we missed something. We really appreciate you taking the extra time, Bill, to answer some questions and share the extra information. So just a couple other things to note. We will send a link to the recording out later this week, so you'll be able to review this information and share it with other folks. If you haven't gotten enough of Bill today, he will be doing a 2-day Tough Kid training on July 13th and 14th as part of the Safe and Civil Schools National Conference in Oregon. You can reach out to safeandcivilschools.com or Pacific Northwest Publishing when you get the link if you're looking for more information on that. We have upcoming information, like the webinar will be available. You'll be able to access the Tough Kid materials and information about the Tough Kid materials at toughkid.com. And we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Jackie.
All right, it looks like things are winding down. We will look into a certificate of attendance and see what we can do for you there for the guests who inquired about that. And I think that is everything. I think we are good to go, Bill. You can.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. It was a real pleasure to do.
No problem.
I appreciate it.
All right.
All right,
Thanks.
see you later.